My name is Melanie Myers. I'm 31 years old. And the day my own mother called my 5-year-old son illegitimate inside a crowded courtroom, something inside me finally died. I still remember the silence that followed her words. It wasn't normal silence. It was the kind that feels heavy, sharp, poisonous. My son was sitting beside me in a tiny navy blue suit, swinging his legs under the wooden bench because they couldn't even touch the floor yet. He looked up at my mother with those wide, innocent eyes, not fully understanding what she meant. But I understood. Every person in that courtroom understood. And my mother, she didn't even look ashamed after saying it. She looked proud, like humiliating me in public was some kind of victory she had waited years for. The judge slowly removed his glasses and stared at her for several seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the lawyers looked uncomfortable. But before he said a single word, my entire life flashed through my mind. Because that moment didn't begin in the courtroom. It began decades earlier inside a cold little house where love was always conditional, and where I learned very young that I would never be enough for my mother. I grew up in a small town in Ohio where everybody knew everybody's business. My father worked long hours repairing trucks, and my mother spent most of her life obsessed with appearances. She cared about church gossip more than her own children, especially me. My younger brother Daniel could do no wrong in her eyes. If he broke something, it was an accident. If I cried, I was dramatic. If he failed a class, the teacher was unfair. If I succeeded at something, my mother would find a way to minimize it. I spent my entire childhood trying to earn affection that never came. By the time I turned 16, I stopped expecting kindness from her completely. She criticized everything about me. My clothes, my hair, my laugh, even the way I walked. "No man wants a difficult woman," she used to say while staring at me across the dinner table. Meanwhile, Daniel got new cars, birthday parties, expensive gifts. I got lectures, rules, silence, and somehow I still kept loving her. That's the tragic thing about daughters. Sometimes we spend years begging for love from people who enjoy watching us starve emotionally. When I was 24, I met Marcus. He wasn't rich. He wasn't flashy. But for the first time in my life, I felt safe around someone. He listened when I spoke. He remembered little details about me. He made me laugh in ways I had forgotten were possible. We rented a tiny apartment together near Columbus, and even though money was tight, those were the happiest years of my life. But my mother hated him instantly. According to her, Marcus wasn't ambitious enough. What she really meant was simple. He couldn't increase her social status. Things got worse when I became pregnant. I was terrified but excited at the same time. Marcus cried when he saw the ultrasound for the first time. He kissed my stomach every night and talked about teaching our son baseball someday. But my mother acted like I had ruined my life. She kept pushing us to get married immediately so the neighbors wouldn't talk. I told her Marcus and planned to marry after saving enough money. That answer embarrassed her more than the pregnancy itself. Then everything fell apart. Marcus died 3 months before our son was born. Drunk driver ran a red light during a storm and crushed the driver's side of his car. I remember standing in the hospital hallway feeling like the floor had disappeared beneath me. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. One second I was playing baby names with the man I loved, and the next I was identifying his body while 7 months pregnant. That kind of pain changes a person permanently. It hollowed me out from the inside. And somehow, my mother still found a way to make it about herself. At Marcus's funeral, she whispered to relatives that this wouldn't have happened if I had made better choices. She complained about the cost of flowers while I stood there barely able to stand upright. After my son, Ethan, was born, she refused to call him by his name for almost a year. She would say things like, "the baby," or "that child." Every visit felt like punishment. Yet I kept allowing her into our lives because a small part of me still hoped she would eventually love us. But people like my mother don't soften with time. They sharpen. When Ethan turned 5, my grandfather passed away. He was the only person in my family who ever treated me with genuine warmth. He used to sneak me candy when I was little and tell me I was smarter than everyone realized. After he died, the family gathered for the reading of his estate. My mother was confident almost everything would go to Daniel. She acted smug the entire week, already talking about renovations and investments before the will was even opened. Then the lawyer read the final pages, and suddenly, the entire room changed. My grandfather had left the majority of his estate to me. Not Daniel, me, the house. The savings, the lake property, almost all of it. I still remember Daniel's face turning pale while my mother sat frozen in complete disbelief. But the real shock came from the final handwritten note my grandfather attached to the will. The lawyer cleared his throat and read it aloud slowly. To my granddaughter, Melanie. Because she spent her whole life loving people who never deserved her. Nobody spoke after that. Nobody. And for the first time in my life, my mother looked at me not with disappointment, but hatred. The moment that will was read aloud, my mother stopped pretending to love me entirely. Before that day, her cruelty used to hide behind fake concern and passive-aggressive smiles. But after my grandfather's estate went to me, the mask disappeared. She began calling me constantly, demanding meetings, accusing me of manipulating an old man during his final years. Daniel joined her too. They both acted like I'd stolen something that belonged to them by birthright. Meanwhile, I was still grieving the only family member who had ever truly protected me. I remember sitting alone in my apartment after the funeral, staring at Ethan asleep on the couch, wondering how the same bloodline could produce both kindness and cruelty. At first, I tried to keep the peace. I offered to help Daniel financially because, despite everything, he was still my brother. But that only made things worse. My mother exploded when she found out. She called me screaming one night, saying I was trying to buy superiority. Then her voice changed into something colder. Something uglier. You think that money makes your child legitimate now? She hissed through the phone. I felt my entire body go numb hearing those words. Ethan was coloring dinosaurs beside me at the kitchen table while she spoke about him, like he was some stain on the family name. That night, I finally snapped. For years, I had swallowed every insult because I thought surviving quietly was strength. But watching my son become a target awakened something dangerous inside me. I told her if she ever spoke about Ethan like that again, she would never see us again. There was silence on the line for several seconds. Then she laughed. Actually laughed. You'll come crawling back eventually, she said calmly. You always do. But for the first time in my life, I hung up on her before she could hang up on me. The following months became a nightmare. My mother started spreading rumors through church circles and extended family. She told people I trapped Marcus with pregnancy before marriage. She implied Ethan might not even be Marcus's child. Some relatives stopped talking to me entirely. Others suddenly treated me differently at gatherings, like scandal was contagious. The worst part was knowing Ethan would eventually grow old enough to hear those whispers himself. I couldn't allow that. So I kept contact with almost everyone in my family and focused entirely on building a stable life for my son. Then the court papers arrived. I still remember opening the envelope with trembling hands while standing in my kitchen. My mother and Daniel were contesting my grandfather's will. According to them, I had emotionally manipulated an elderly man into changing the estate before his death. It was absurd, cruel, but it was also dangerous. The estate represented security for Ethan's future, and they knew that. They wanted to drain me emotionally and financially until I gave up. My lawyer warned me the process could take months, maybe longer. That night, after Ethan fell asleep, I sat on the bathroom floor crying silently into a towel because I didn't want him hearing me break apart again. The hearings began 2 months later. Every court appearance felt suffocating. My mother arrived dressed elegantly, smiling politely at strangers like she was attending brunch instead of tearing apart her own daughter publicly. Daniel avoided eye contact with me completely. Their attorney painted me as unstable, manipulative, emotionally reckless. They brought up Marcus's death repeatedly, almost using my grief against me. Each session left me exhausted. But the worst moments weren't the legal arguments. It was watching my mother sit only a few feet away from me, completely comfortable destroying me piece by piece. One afternoon after court, Ethan ran toward me outside the building holding a little drawing he made while waiting with my babysitter. It was a picture of me, him, and Marcus holding hands under a giant yellow sun. "That's Daddy," he said proudly, pointing at the sketch with his tiny finger. My chest tightened instantly. Before I could answer, I noticed my mother standing nearby watching us. Her face twisted with disgust. Then she muttered something quietly to Daniel. I couldn't hear all of it, except 2 words. Fatherless mistake. I saw red. I marched toward her so fast my lawyer tried grabbing my arm. Years of humiliation exploded out of me at once. I asked her how she could speak about a child that way. Her own grandson. But she didn't back down. In fact, she looked almost energized by my anger. "Truth hurts," she replied coldly. "If Marcus cared so much, he would have married you before dying." I swear the entire sidewalk went silent after she said that. Even strangers nearby looked uncomfortable. My hands shook violently, not from fear anymore, but rage. That evening, my lawyer called with news that changed everything. During document discovery, they uncovered something suspicious involving Daniel and my grandfather's finances shortly before his death. Large withdrawals, missing records, unauthorized account access. At first, I couldn't process what he was implying. Then slowly, the truth began forming in my mind like a storm cloud. The lawsuit was never about fairness. It was desperation. And suddenly I realized something terrifying. They weren't trying to expose me. They were trying to hide themselves. My lawyer invited me to his office the next morning, and I could tell from his expression that this was bigger than we originally thought. He closed the door carefully, slid a thick folder across the desk, and told me to prepare myself before opening it. Inside were bank statements, transaction histories, and signed authorization forms connected to my grandfather's accounts. Daniel had been withdrawing money for nearly 2 years before Grandpa died. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Thousands disappearing quietly while the rest of us believed Grandpa's finances were untouched. My stomach twisted as I flipped through the pages because one signature looked painfully familiar. My mother's. I remember sitting there frozen while my lawyer explained everything slowly. According to the records, Daniel had access to accounts he legally shouldn't have touched alone. Several transfers happened while my grandfather was hospitalized and heavily medicated. One withdrawal had even been made only 3 days before he died. My mother's name appeared repeatedly beside Daniel's in supporting documents. Suddenly, her obsession with the inheritance made horrifying sense. They already knew they were vulnerable. If the estate investigation went deep enough, their own financial misconduct could surface publicly. What happens if this reaches the judge? I asked quietly. My lawyer leaned back in his chair and looked me dead in the eyes. It could destroy their entire case. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me. Not relief exactly, but clarity. My mother spent my whole life convincing me I was weak, emotional, inferior. Yet here she was, panicking because truth had finally entered the room. And the more evidence investigators uncovered, the uglier things became. My grandfather had apparently confronted Daniel shortly before his death about missing funds. A nurse even remembered hearing raised voices during one hospital visit. After that confrontation, Grandpa changed his will completely. Not out of confusion, out of betrayal. Meanwhile, my mother kept escalating publicly. She began posting vague insults online about immoral daughters and children born without proper values. People in town started gossiping harder than ever. Some sided with her because she played the grieving Christian mother perfectly. Others quietly supported me but were too afraid to speak openly. That's the thing about small towns. People love truth, until truth becomes inconvenient socially. I stopped reading comments entirely after someone referred to Ethan as the bastard grandson. I threw my phone across the room so hard the screen shattered. That night, Ethan climbed into my lap while I cried on the couch. He touched my face gently with his tiny hands and asked why Grandma hated us. No child should ever ask that question. I tried explaining that some people carry bitterness inside them for so long that they stop recognizing love when it's right in front of them. But honestly, I was trying to convince myself too. Ethan rested his head against my chest and whispered, "Daddy loved us, though." And that sentence nearly broke me completely. A week before the final hearing, my mother showed up at my house unexpectedly. I opened the door and almost didn't recognize her. She looked exhausted beneath all the makeup and jewelry, but her eyes still carried that same cold calculation I had feared since childhood. She asked if we could talk privately. Against my better judgment, I let her inside. Ethan was upstairs asleep, and the entire house felt painfully tense the moment she entered. She glanced around at the furniture, the framed photos, the peaceful life I had built without her, and I could see resentment burning behind her smile. Then she made me an offer. She said if I dropped the investigation into Daniel's finances and agreed to split the inheritance quietly, the family could heal. I actually laughed because the audacity was unbelievable. After years of humiliation, after attacking my son publicly, suddenly she wanted peace. But the moment I refused, her expression darkened instantly. She stepped closer to me and lowered her voice until it sounded almost threatening. "You have no idea what this family is capable of protecting," she whispered. I stared at her for several seconds before answering. "No," I said softly. "I finally do." She left furious after that conversation, slamming the front door so hard the walls shook. But what terrified me most wasn't her anger. It was the look in her eyes right before she walked away. She looked desperate, cornered, like someone realizing control was slipping through their fingers permanently. And desperate people are dangerous. My lawyer warned me to document everything moving forward because the final court hearing would likely become ugly. He was right. The courtroom on the final day was completely packed. Relatives filled nearly every bench. Some came for support. Others came for entertainment. I walked in holding Ethan's hand while reporters from a local paper whispered near the entrance. My mother sat beside Daniel wearing a cream-colored suit and pearl necklace, pretending to look calm. But I noticed her fingers trembling slightly against the table. For once, she was afraid too. And then the hearing began. And within 1 hour, my family started destroying itself in front of everyone. The tension inside that courtroom felt unbearable from the very beginning. You could practically feel people waiting for something explosive to happen. My lawyer stood calmly beside me, organizing documents, while Daniel kept wiping sweat from his forehead every few minutes. My mother, however, still tried maintaining control over the room with posture alone. Chin lifted. Perfect smile. Elegant clothing. She looked less like a grieving daughter and more like a politician preparing for cameras. But the moment the financial records were introduced into evidence, I saw panic flash across her face for the first time. The judge examined the documents carefully while my lawyer explained the unauthorized withdrawals connected to Daniel and my mother. Every page seemed to tighten the pressure inside the courtroom further. Relatives sitting behind us began whispering loudly among themselves. Daniel looked physically sick now, barely able to keep eye contact with anyone. Then my lawyer revealed the handwritten notes from my grandfather's nurse, describing arguments about missing money shortly before his death. The atmosphere shifted instantly. This was no longer about a confused old man manipulated by his granddaughter. Suddenly, my mother and brother looked like people trying desperately to bury their own misconduct. Then Daniel cracked. It happened so fast, nobody expected it. The judge asked him a direct question about one of the withdrawals, and Daniel completely unraveled under pressure. His voice started shaking. He contradicted himself twice within the same sentence. Then, out of nowhere, he blurted that my mother told him taking the money was basically an advance on the inheritance anyway. The entire courtroom erupted into whispers. My mother snapped toward him with pure fury in her eyes, but the damage was already done. Years of manipulation and favoritism collapsed in seconds because the golden child finally broke when consequences became real. But somehow, my mother still found a way to sink lower. During a heated exchange, my lawyer mentioned Ethan while explaining why my grandfather trusted me with the estate. He talked about stability, responsibility, and protecting future generations. That's when my mother suddenly stood up without permission and pointed directly toward my son sitting beside my babysitter in the back row. Her face twisted with rage as she raised her voice loud enough for every person in the courtroom to hear. "That child should never have been part of this family in the first place," she shouted. "He's illegitimate." The words slammed into the courtroom like broken glass. Everything froze. I felt Ethan grab my arm instantly because even at 5 years old, he understood enough to know something terrible had just happened. My chest tightened so violently I could barely breathe. People around us looked horrified. One woman in the gallery actually covered her mouth with her hand. My mother stood there breathing heavily, completely consumed by anger, while my son stared at her in confusion and fear. And for one painful second, I was no longer a grown woman in a courtroom. I was a little girl again, being humiliated by the one person who was supposed to protect me. Then the judge spoke. Slowly, he removed his glasses and placed them on the desk in front of him. His voice wasn't loud when he answered her. That's what made it so powerful. The entire courtroom leaned forward to hear every single word. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "the only thing illegitimate I've witnessed in this courtroom is the behavior of a grandmother willing to emotionally wound a child in public to avoid accountability for her own actions." Absolute silence. Nobody moved. Nobody dared speak. My mother's face lost all color instantly. Even Daniel stared at the floor like he wanted to disappear. The judge continued, explaining that Ethan's birth circumstances had absolutely no relevance to inheritance law or moral worth. Then he looked directly at my mother again and said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. A child is never responsible for the bitterness of adults. I felt tears burning down my face before I even realized I was crying. Ethan leaned against me quietly while the courtroom remained frozen in stunned silence. For years, my mother controlled every room through shame and intimidation. But now, for the first time in her life, someone with authority had publicly exposed her cruelty exactly as it was. No excuses, no masks, no church gossip to protect her. Just truth standing under fluorescent courtroom lights for everyone to see. The final ruling came less than an hour later. The judge dismissed their challenge against the will entirely. He also ordered further investigation into the financial misconduct involving Daniel and my mother. Reporters rushed outside the courthouse before proceedings even fully ended. Relatives avoided eye contact with me as they hurried out of the room whispering among themselves. My mother remained seated motionless at the table, staring ahead blankly, like she still couldn't comprehend how completely everything had collapsed around her. But the moment that stayed with me most happened right before I walked out. Ethan tugged gently on my sleeve and whispered one small question into my ear. "Mommy, what does illegitimate mean?" And honestly, that hurt more than anything else. I couldn't answer Ethan's question right away. My throat closed completely the moment he asked it. We were standing outside the courthouse while reporters shouted questions nearby and cameras flashed everywhere around us. But all I could focus on was my little boy staring up at me, waiting for an explanation he was too young to hear. I knelt down slowly and held his face in my hands. Then I told him the only truth that mattered. "It means absolutely nothing about who you are," I whispered. "Some people use ugly words when their hearts are ugly. Ethan studied my face quietly for a second before wrapping his arms around my neck. And right there on those courthouse steps, I realized I was no longer surviving for myself alone. The weeks after the trial felt strangely quiet, almost eerie. For years, my life had been filled with tension, criticism, and emotional warfare. Suddenly, the phone stopped ringing. The gossip faded. Relatives who once avoided me began sending awkward apology messages pretending they had never agreed with my mother's behavior. But I ignored most of them. People who stand silently beside cruelty are rarely innocent themselves. Meanwhile, investigators officially opened a fraud case against Daniel regarding the missing money from my grandfather's accounts. Last I heard, he accepted a financial settlement agreement to avoid criminal prosecution. My mother's social circle collapsed almost overnight once the truth became public. And the woman who once controlled everyone through shame suddenly found herself completely alone. About 3 months later, she came to my house one final time. I remember opening the door and feeling shocked by how much she had changed already. She looked smaller somehow, older. The confidence that once filled every room around her was gone completely. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked if she could see Ethan, not me. Not her grandson's mother. Just Ethan, but something inside me remained still and guarded now. I told her no gently, but firmly. Because protecting my child mattered more than rescuing her from the consequences of her own cruelty. She started crying almost immediately. Not dramatic tears. Not manipulative ones. Real tears. And honestly, that hurt too. She admitted she spent years resenting me because my father loved me differently. Apparently, Grandpa used to defend me constantly behind closed doors, which only deepened her bitterness over time. She confessed that every achievement of mine felt like personal rejection to her. Hearing that explanation should have satisfied me after all the pain she caused. But instead, I just felt tired. Deeply tired. Because some wounds begin long before we're born. Passed down quietly through generations like poison disguised as family tradition. Before leaving, my mother looked toward the hallway where Ethan's laughter echoed faintly from another room. Then she asked one final question in a trembling voice. "Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" I looked at her for a long moment before answering honestly. "I don't know," I said softly. "But I know I won't teach him to hate himself the way you taught me." She broke down completely after hearing that. That was the last time I saw her. A year later, Ethan and I moved to the lake house my grandfather left us. It became our fresh start. We painted the walls bright colors together. We planted flowers near the porch every spring. And sometimes at night, Ethan would sit beside the water asking questions about Marcus. I told him everything. How his father laughed. How he danced terribly in the kitchen. How excited he was the day we learned Ethan was coming. I refused to let my son grow up shaped by shame the way I did. He deserved truth, love, safety, things I spent most of my life begging for. One evening while cleaning old boxes in the attic, I found another handwritten note from my grandfather tucked inside a photo album. The paper was yellowed and folded carefully. I sat beside the window reading it while rain tapped softly against the glass outside. His handwriting shook slightly across the page, but the message was painfully clear. Family is not the people who share your blood. Family is the people who protect your heart when others try to destroy it. I cried harder reading that note than I did winning the court case. Because by then, I finally understood. The greatest revenge was never humiliating my mother publicly. It was breaking the cycle she tried to bury me in. It was raising a son who would never question whether he deserved love. And sometimes, late at night when the world becomes quiet again, I still think about that courtroom. About the silence after my mother called my child illegitimate. About the judge defending a little boy he didn't even know. About the exact moment I stopped seeing myself as powerless. Some people inherit money. Some inherit pain. But every once in a while, someone chooses to inherit neither. And that's where healing finally begins.